Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today is the fourth and final webinar for the SEER project, which aims to synthesize the current knowledge around environmental effects of offshore wind energy development. There's interest in the United States to continue development of offshore wind energy as a renewable source for electricity generation, and this webinar series is discussing the current understanding around the environmental effects of that development. Today, we'll be focused on two topics that cover the effects of electromagnetic fields on marine life, and then secondly, the effects of vessel collision on marine life. For today's agenda, we will first welcome an introduction from the U.S. Department of Energy, and then split the remainder of the webinar between the two topic areas, starting with electromagnetic field effects, and then moving on to vessel collisions. For each topic area, the SEER team will present a topic overview, host a panel discussion with subject matter experts, and then follow up with a question and answer session. If you have questions that come up during the presentation, please enter them directly into the chat. We'll use those questions to moderate the Q&A session at the end of each presentation. With that, I'd like to welcome Joy Page to provide an introduction to this webinar. Joy is the Environmental Program Manager at the U.S. Department of Energy's Wind Energy Technology Office, who, along with her colleagues, helps guide the objectives of this project. Thanks for joining us this morning, Joy.
Thank you, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound great.
Awesome. Well, once again, good morning, everybody. I am so pleased and excited to help kick off, as Mark said, the fourth of 4 in our webinar series on the effects of electromagnetic fields and vessel collisions on marine life from offshore wind energy. And again, I'm Joy Page. I've done the introduction for the last 3, so I think most of you know me by now, but as Mark said, I manage the Wind Energy Technology Office's environmental research portfolio. And it's not just research. I think this stakeholder engagement represented by SEER is just as important, if not more, as we embark on these efforts. The great news is if you missed the last 3 webinars, you can still see them. They're already updated on Tethys, and those include underwater noise and entanglement considerations for offshore wind, effects of offshore wind farm structure on fish ecology and benthic disturbance, and then the last one that we just had was bat and bird interactions with offshore wind energy. So for quick background, for those of you that haven't seen any of our webinars and aren't familiar with SEER, the objective of SEER is really to build relationships among the science and policy communities on both coasts. And through that stakeholder engagement, summarize our understanding of the science, monitoring, and mitigation in a way that's broadly accessible both to scientists and policymakers alike. We also want to prioritize knowledge gaps in research, understand where that state of the science may be lacking, and then collaborate to fill those research gaps. So Mark, next slide. So to accomplish this, SEER implements a 3-pronged approach. The first, research briefs, second, webinars, which y'all are on today, and then finally a series of worksheets. So for the research briefs, SEER has painstakingly condensed this full category of offshore wind and wildlife to 7 key issues. And they continue to release those, and those are available on the Tethys sites. And while there are many syntheses being prepared, we don't want these to be redundant, but we're really trying to make them broadly accessible and using terms that everyone can understand. And we are so fortunate developing these research briefs that we have an amazing cross-sector science and technology committee who have donated their time and painstakingly reviewed them and making sure we get the information right. So I really wanted to acknowledge them and thank them. The second part of SEER is the webinar series, which you all are here again. This is the 4th. And we're really excited that these webinars will live on Tethys so you can refer to them. And it gives an opportunity for stakeholders to hear from scientists in the field, ask their questions, and get more intimately acquainted with the knowledge. The final aspect of SEERs is 2 workshops. One will be on the Atlantic, and that will be coordinated with the Regional Wildlife Science Entity, and then a second on the Pacific, where we're bringing together researchers and trying to understand what are the key priorities for future research. And at DOE, I really think, as I was mentioning in the beginning, that this work is critical to deployment, especially if we're going to meet the administration's goal to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. We need to be working together. We need to be communicating, aligning our research goals, sharing resources, and we're hopeful that SEER can help do that. And I really want to stress the communication piece. So if you have any questions or concerns, please reach out to PNNL or NREL. They're incredibly knowledgeable on this topic, and they're incredibly amenable to comments. Or feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm always happy to chat and brainstorm. So yeah, once again, thank you again to NREL and the PNNL team and the S&T committees. Congratulations on 4 amazing webinars, and I'm looking forward to this final one. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Joy. And that's a great intro to this project. And so now we'll transition to our first topic area around electromagnetic fields on marine life. I'm Mark Severy. I'm a research scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Lab, and I work on the environmental effects and environmental monitoring technologies for offshore wind. We prepared this synthesis with my colleagues at PNNL and our fantastic project partners at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, and we had guidance both from subject matter experts who will join us in the panel discussion and our advisory committee. So with that, I'm going to jump into the content for today. And so where I want to start is just describing where are power cables used in offshore wind farms, and this will help guide our understanding of what EMF is and where it occurs. So offshore wind energy uses electric power cables to collect electricity from all of the turbines and send it back to shore. Power cables are a source of electromagnetic fields, or EMF, at these offshore wind farms. So if we want to look at where these cables are used at offshore wind farms to get a better understanding of where EMF occur. Submarine power cables are used for 2 main purposes at offshore wind farms. The first is to connect individual turbines together in strings. These are known as inter-array cables. This top image shows an example of how inter-array cables can be configured to connect individual wind turbines together. The second way power cables are used is the export cable, and this is the cable that transmits power from the wind farm back to shore. Inter-array cables generally use alternating current power systems, or AC power systems, and export cables can use both AC, or for longer distance runs, they may use DC power transmission. For fixed bottom offshore wind turbines, as shown in the bottom left image, most cables will be buried within the seabed. When there's geologic or ecological features that don't allow trenching to actually bury that cable, the cable may be placed on top of the seabed and then covered or protected with a concrete mattress or rocks. For floating offshore wind farms, much of the cable will also be buried as it transitions back to shore, but a portion of the cable may be floating in the water column, as shown in the graphic on the bottom right. And now, after an understanding of where power cables may be used, I want to provide a brief intro and background about electromagnetic fields. So EMF are a type of low frequency radiation that are generated from both natural and anthropogenic or human-caused sources. EMF are a part of the electromagnetic spectrum that you may be familiar with. This includes X-rays, visible light, and radio waves. But electromagnetic fields are categorized as being extremely low frequency electromagnetic fields that have a very long wavelength and a low energy. EMF are generated by many sources, which include the Earth's geomagnetic field, thunderstorms and lightning, and also power cables, which is the source we're talking about today. Subsea power cables, such as those used at offshore wind farms, emit EMF that can add to or alter other natural sources of electric and magnetic fields in the marine environment. While EMF effects are not a subject exclusive to power cables for offshore wind, they're certainly an important consideration in the evaluation of environmental effects at these locations. EMF from power cables include two distinct and separate components, an electric field or E field, and then also a magnetic field or B field. It's important to think about these components as separate factors because different animals can sense and use these signals in different ways. Electric fields are produced when a power cable has an electric charge or has a voltage. Magnetic fields are produced when electric current or power is flowing through the cable, such as when power is being produced at the wind farm. Magnetic fields also create a secondary electric field known as an induced electric field or IE field, when magnetic field changes direction either in space or changes strength in time. Induced electric fields are created around AC cables as a result of the AC magnetic field rotating about the cable. And further, motion-induced electric fields are created when a conductive object, such as a fish, moves through a magnetic field. Going back to the electric fields are able to be contained within subsea cables. Subsea cables are shielded and grounded as part of their engineering design, and this eliminates most of the emissions of E fields into the surrounding environment, as long as that cable is not damaged. Magnetic fields, on the other hand, are not contained within the cable and will be emitted into the surrounding area. The strength of the magnetic field and the associated induced electric fields will change depending on the amount of electric current flowing through those cables. This graphic provides an illustration of the different components of EMF in a submarine environment, including EMF from natural sources and from the power cable running through this graphic that's shown in red. The black lines in the background of this image show the geomagnetic field, which is naturally occurring in all locations on Earth. In the top right of the image, you'll see some light orange lines indicating a bioelectric field that is created by an organism. So these are just natural sources of EMF that exist at the bottom of the ocean at all times. From the power cable itself, the electric field, as we discussed just previously, is contained within the cable shielding, so it's not shown on this graphic. The magnetic field is shown here in blue, being emitted from the cable. And lastly, the fish moving through the magnetic field is creating an induced electric field, which is shown in yellow. That graphic, the first one on the left, was showing EMF from a DC cable, and the graphic on the right shows EMF from an AC cable, which is just slightly different. From an AC cable, the one addition we see to the graphic is an induced electric field shown in red that is created around the cable itself as a result of the rotating nature of AC magnetic fields. And I have one more slide just on the background of EMF, and it really just is to describe that the strength of magnetic fields and associated induced electric fields decrease with the distance from the cable. The field strength is strongest immediately next to the cable with the highest intensities, and then decreasing as you move away from the cable, typically with the strongest EMF within the first few meters. And as we transition now to talking about the effects on marine life, it's also important to highlight that high intensity EMF does not necessarily indicate more potential effect on marine life. EMF sensitive species use specialized receptors to detect EMF in a particular range. So it's possible that lower intensity magnetic fields are more easily perceptible to some species, while the higher strength fields may be outside of their perceptible range. So it's just something to keep in mind as we start to think about which species can detect and then respond to electromagnetic signals. Several different marine species are capable of detecting electric and magnetic fields. For example, some fish can detect electric fields, and magnetic fields can be detected by salmon, some sea turtles, whales, and some invertebrates. Sharks, skates, and rays are able to detect both electric and magnetic fields. These species use these senses for a variety of life functions, including navigation and orientation, where animals use the geomagnetic field to navigate during migrations or orient themselves towards a specific direction. The senses are also used by some species to detect predators or prey. And lastly, some animals will use EMF to either avoid or be attracted to particular areas. EMF from subsea cables has the potential to stimulate behaviors in marine life that would normally occur in response to natural EMF signals, such as from the Earth's magnetic field or from other predators or prey. EMF may temporarily disrupt some animals' ability to sense natural EMF sources when they're in the vicinity of a subsea cable. Controlled field studies of marine life around subsea cables have observed some behavioral changes for some species. For example, the American lobster exhibited an exploratory response around a cable. Little skate traveled greater distances with lower speeds and more directional changes. Small spotted cat shark were found more frequently near the cable when the cable was powered on. And some sensitive species, such as the thornback ray and spiny dogfish, did not display any statistically significant behavioral changes near the power cable. Several technical, geographic, and biologic factors must be considered to understand the potential for EMF to affect marine life. These include considerations such as cable characteristics, what type of cable is it, what type of EMF and what strength is it being emitted at. Secondly, we need to understand the marine life detection range to understand whether it overlaps with the EMF being emitted from the cable. The location of the cable, the likelihood of marine life encountering that cable, how those marine life may respond to EMF, and then what are the mechanisms that those responses could result in a potential environmental impact. So despite the behavioral effects observed in some species, which we discussed on the previous slide, no impacts have been interpreted as substantially negative or have been observed on electro or magnetosensitive species after exposure to EMF from a subsea cable. However, the evidence base for this is somewhat limited. Measuring or modeling the strength and extent of EMF is an important step to understand if a cable has the potential for these environmental effects. Magnetic fields can be modeled to show how EMF spread into the surrounding environment, both horizontally and vertically, as shown on the image to the right. However, models for EMF are not commonly used by the industry or easily available for use as part of the cable design and siting process. In order to measure and monitor EMF in the marine environment, there are several monitoring methods and then also a few mitigation or minimization strategies. The effects from EMF can be monitored by measuring the strength of a magnetic and induced electric field with devices on the seabed, or animal behavior around subsea cables can be monitored to identify behavioral changes near sources of EMF. The effects from EMF can be minimized through siting by routing cables to avoid habitats with species of concern, by burying the cable to add a physical separation between the EMF being emitted and the marine life. I also want to note here that burying the cable does not actually eliminate the EMF, it just separates the distance between where the cable is and where marine life are most commonly occurring. And then lastly, the placement of the cable can also minimize EMF, such as by decreasing distance between parallel cables, it keeps EMF within a smaller physical range. So overall, the effects of EMF have been considered minor to negligible and a less significant issue than other environmental effects at offshore wind farms, but the confidence in this remains low. EMF should be considered in more depth on a site-specific basis if electro or magnetosensitive species are present, and the cable design process does not reduce EMF below perceptible levels. Further research is needed to understand if EMF from subsea cables produces long-term or cumulative effects on marine life. Studies could focus on taking measurements to help validate models and identify EMF intensity and range, developing real-time sensors to monitor EMF over time and correlating those data with cable properties and power flow. And lastly, understanding how species respond to EMF at different stages of their life cycle and whether EMF can create impacts that will result in a population level change. So with that overview, I'd like to now welcome our panelists to join me in a short panel discussion. Our first panelist is Andrew Gill. Andrew is a principal scientist based at CFAS, a main agency of the UK government providing marine and freshwater science expertise and advice. An applied ecological scientist, Andrew joined CFAS with 28 years of experience, principally in the university sector. His current focus is as strategic lead for offshore and marine renewable energy at OMRE, and further developing CFAS-wide initiatives into the decarbonization agenda. His research interests include fish and fisheries, interactions with offshore and marine renewable energy emissions such as electromagnetic fields and noise, cumulative ecological impact assessment, environmental risk and uncertainty, ecological aspects of offshore and marine renewable energy interactions, and socioeconomic systems to assist decision-making. Andrew has chaired and served on many international committees and authored and co-authored several cross-disciplinary international journal articles, book chapters, and scientific reports. He is co-chair of the ICES Working Group Offshore Wind Developments and Fisheries from 2020 to 2022. Our second panelist, Zoe Hutchison, is an early career ecological researcher working on offshore and marine renewable energy effects on marine species at the University of St. Andrews, Scotland, following a postdoctoral position at the University of Rhode Island in the US. She has established international expertise leading research projects on subsea, cable, electromagnetic field emissions, and understanding their influence on receptive species. Zoe has published several key articles to convey the concept of EMF and the application of the research findings. She has served on several national and international committees. I'm very pleased to have both Zoe and Andrew join me today. Their articles and research have been instrumental in understanding the state of knowledge around EMF, in particular related to offshore wind. So with that, maybe let's just kick off the panel discussion to Zoe and ask, what is the current understanding that you might like to highlight for the environmental effects associated with offshore wind and EMF? Are there any lessons learned that you would like to share today?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for the invitation to be here today as well. In terms of our current understanding, you gave a great overview there. I think it's worth highlighting that our current understanding is very much based in a very patchy evidence base. It's important to remember that when we review the literature that is available, we have to think about the relevance and context in relation to offshore wind, not just take the evidence as it's presented, because it's not always of the same levels that are appropriate. There's a whole variety of methods that are used, which is great, but it's also about how appropriate they are and how they're honed into the question that we're trying to answer, and using that information in the best way possible to assess the potential impacts. As you highlighted, there's a lot of there's different components to the electromagnetic field, and by far I think the priority in the literature tends to be on the magnetic field, but the induced electric field can be important, and we have to take the sensitivity of the species, as in their sensory abilities, into consideration when we're reviewing that as well. We don't necessarily have great evidence for any one particular species as to how they respond to electromagnetic fields and if they have a greater or lesser effect in terms of AC or DC. And so we have to take those kind of differences in the literature into consideration. I think it's also worth highlighting that we're very guilty of taking our own perception, and it's very important to actually consider it from the perspective of the species and how they may interact with the electromagnetic field. And from that, it's not just about how they may detect the electromagnetic field, like there's the sensory apparatus and how that works. It's also about, as you highlighted, like how that changes through their life cycle, but also their movement ecology. And how that means that they will actually encounter the electromagnetic field in a real environment setting.
Thanks, Zoe. That's great to hear. Andrew, kind of the same question to you. Do you have anything to highlight or add to in terms of what Zoe's saying about the lessons learned so far?
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and again, thanks as well for the invite to join in, because this is a difficult topic area, and so having these kind of opportunities and these sort of webinars to try and assist understanding and sort of knowledge transfer is hugely important. So we congratulate you on this initiative, NREL and PNNL. And the fact we've got over 100 people is good to see. I think Zoe's covered a whole bunch of things there that need to be highlighted. I suppose in addition to that, I would say that one of the things that we have to be really clear about is the realism of what we're doing, because there's a variety of ways to look at the topic of EMF. You can look at it from a modeling perspective, which is kind of an engineering approach using the characteristics of the cable, and that's fine. We can get these nice sort of graphics with the colors on, but they're static. This is a dynamic environment. The animals are moving around, the power generation is moving. So it's a variable sort of picture. So really what we need is a sort of almost like a pulsating or a change in understanding of what the animals are going to encounter. So that the realism is important. And that then translates to how we do the studies. So the studies that we do, which might be controlled studies, some of them have been in laboratories, some of them, like the ones we've done, have been sort of in the marine environment, but using more controlled methodologies, have to try and take the variability into account. And also, the reason that variability is important is it gives us the realism of what is actually being emitted, because just referring back to the models, we might use the maximum amount of power that goes through the cable and produce this aura, but we know the wind doesn't blow all the time. So the animals are not always going to encounter the same amount of EMF and the same amount of energy. And that's where the sort of final point I want to make is we need to work with others, such as the engineers and the oceanographers, to understand the environment itself. Even sort of ocean physicists about the geomagnetic field, how that is in the local area, how the cables are going to be producing the fields. And the reason I'm saying this is that we've actually done some measurements out in the field, and those measurements have demonstrated that whilst some of the models agree with some of the measurements, we've also been measuring other fields that we didn't expect to find there. And that's probably down to this, the movement of water, the geomagnetic field in the background that needs to be taken into account, and the sort of the way that the EMF is actually interacting with the local environment. And that's all really important in relation to what Zoe said, is how the animals are going to perceive it, what time of their life cycle are they going to do that, and how are they exposed. So it's I think realism and working together in order to understand that environment is really hugely important for us to be able to put the context on environmental effects.
Thanks, Andrew. And would you mind expanding a bit to talk about some of the either emerging or state-of-the-art measurement and monitoring techniques for EMF that could be used?
Yeah, I think it's there's two sides to this coin. Magnetic fields are relatively easy to measure, so that's good. We can tick that. We can actually go and buy off-the-shelf magnetometers, and some of them can be very sophisticated and do it in 3 dimensions, etc. But we can do that. But measuring electric fields is really, really hard. But as you pointed out in the presentation, there are those 2 elements that we have to be aware of. But primarily, There are bespoke devices that have been developed in different parts of the world, either remote methods, you mentioned ROVs, or even AUVs, or automated underwater vehicles that can pre-design paths and measure the fields going over a power cable. We can also, in terms of getting a good understanding of this variability I was talking about, is think about not just the method and going out and measuring it once, but how we can collect data which relates to the power generation aspect. One of the ways that people are looking at that in the Netherlands, for instance, they've actually taken a magnetometer and buried it on the beach, which might sound a bit weird, as this is an offshore wind farm subsea cable, but actually magnetic fields don't respect whether you're in the air, whether you're in the sand, whether you're in the sea. So you can measure it, actually, they're measuring it on the shore, whether it's coming ashore on the export cable. That's going to give us a lot of information over a long period of time. So that's quite an innovative way to do things. But of course, it doesn't allow us to understand the electric field, but it gives us an indication of maybe the variability in the magnetic field. And once we have that, then we can start looking at, using physical principles, you can predict the kind of induced electric fields you might have, and then you can go and do the measurements potentially out at sea. So it's an area where there's not many devices have been developed. There's a few, like I said, being looked at, but because of you mentioned that the EMF has been looked at as being relatively negligible, then there hasn't been a drive to actually do this, to actually go out and measure. But we can assist the process by, like I said, thinking about the environment itself and collecting that data over longer periods of time. That's the sort of the state of the art thing, I would say. It doesn't sound particularly state of the art in terms of technology, but using the right bit of technology, the kit to understand the environment is really important in terms of the appropriateness, so that we are interpreting this in relation to the animal's potential exposure.
Sure, that all makes a lot of sense. And Zoe, it's, monitoring is part of the picture, understanding the landscape and how animals respond and how the EMF is being emitted. But then kind of the other side of that is, are there minimization techniques that for EMF that should be considered to reduce EMF effects for offshore wind development?
Yeah, so the measurement side of things is obviously really important. I don't think monitoring is necessarily in place yet, so it'd be nice to see that. In terms of the minimisation of the electromagnetic field, I think that, well, if you think of it in terms of mitigation, then first and foremost, it's like, what is it that we're mitigating? What component is it that we're trying to mitigate, and for what reason? What levels would be considered mitigative to the particular species in question? Burial, as you highlighted in your presentation, burying a cable does not change the electromagnetic field. It produces a physical barrier and prevents an animal getting closer to the source, therefore reducing the potential exposure. But it doesn't necessarily mean that reduces the potential effect. It really has to be taken into consideration for the receptive species in question. In terms of technology that can minimise the electromagnetic field, though, while burial will produce the physical barrier, there are potentially cable technologies that can be used that might actually reduce the electromagnetic field emission, or potentially by having cables closer or further apart, you can take the exposure and also the spatial extent of the exposure into consideration as well. So for example, the cable that we've been studying, the bundled cables and their proximity to each other is something that really influences the electromagnetic field. And similarly, if you have cables from multiple wind farms coming along a cable corridor, then that's something that might be able to be taken into consideration as well. Routing cables to avoid areas is something that could also be considered. Obviously, you'd have to have quite good evidence that it was strongly required, because that would more than likely be very expensive, with a lot more cable being required. And so for me personally, I think that we have to first establish what is it that we're trying to mitigate? What levels are we trying to reach, and do we have good evidence to suggest that that's required? And then consider the cable technologies, and appropriate siting and distances from each other would probably be the best way forward.
Great. And if you don't mind, let's stay on this topic for a little bit. I noticed a few questions coming in on the chat, and one of them was about the options or the ability to shield export and inter-array cables. Can you maybe expand on that a bit, and maybe some of the electric fields you've seen in some of your work?
Sure. So the shielding of the cable doesn't stop the magnetic field. In the perfectly grounded situation, it will contain the electric field, that's the electric current running through it, but the magnetic field will still be emitted into the environment no matter what the shielding is. And when we're modelling the electromagnetic field, the cable properties, the different layers of insulation around it is something that's taken into consideration. And I think companies do that as well. So industry partners, when they produce their cable plans and they do their cabling, their assessment of the electromagnetic field and the attenuation of that, they take that into consideration too. But the magnetic field will pass through unaltered into the surrounding environment, and it will interact with the surrounding electromagnetic, like the natural electromagnetic environment, whatever that is, whether that's the geomagnetic field or bioelectric field, whatever it is that's there. The induced electric field arises from the magnetic field, so it's not something that's going to be contained by the sheathing either. It is something, if it's an AC cable, then the induced electric field is a natural component of the magnetic field and the time-varying nature of that. So the shielding is not really effective in terms of the electromagnetic field emissions. And something that has to be taken into consideration. Naturally, the in-field cables or the inter-array cables typically carry a lower capacity of energy, and therefore they're likely to produce lower electromagnetic fields. But lower doesn't necessarily mean better. Something that we have to be aware of is that the intensity of electromagnetic field that's produced, it's not like we have, so if you consider an animal where you have a noise threshold and you have a good understanding of their hearing range, we don't have that for electromagnetic field, electromagnetic species that can receptive species, sorry. So for the electroreceptive species and also the magnetoreceptive species, we don't have the specific range that would be considered out of scope for their ability to detect it. And so we don't necessarily have something to aim for there.
Yeah, I understand that's a challenge for sure.
Yeah.
Maybe moving on to our next question, Andrew. How might the effects of EMF contribute to cumulative impacts on marine life that result from the combined effects of multiple activities in industry? What are some of the challenges with doing a cumulative impacts analysis for offshore wind and EMF?
Yeah, well, cumulative impacts themselves is a topic that you could probably have a seminar series on as well. But in terms of EMF, this is where really the driver for understanding EMF comes from, because from one single cable, the EMF, as we see, can be deemed fairly minimal or negligible, and that's, you know, depending on the characteristics of the species of the cable, may be true for one site. But what we are really trying to understand is this cumulative aspect of, if we're going to be putting lots of cables in the water, there's lots of inter-array cables going in, albeit they're lower EMF values. Export cables to shore, the examples that were shown earlier on was one cable, but I mean, for instance, we've got a wind farm in the UK, it's got 7 export cables to shore. You know, so the number of cables is going to influence the potential encounter for your animals, and so the cumulative aspect is just look at it first of all in terms of multiple offshore winds, which, such as you've planned up the east coast of the US, is that if the animals encounter the EMF each time and they respond in a similar way, then how does that then potentially impinge on them, or does it? You know, is that going to have an effect? And the idea here is, you know, it is that if you have a certain time of life where they're going to have to cross these cables, do they respond in the same way to each one? Maybe they respond the first time they encounter them, and then nothing seems to happen to them, and they maybe learn about it or habituate, because a lot of these animals are very clever. You know, they have good sized brains, particularly things like the sharks. So they might actually be able to habituate or learn about it. So that might be quite good, but we need to understand that. But one of the key issues is, if an animal learning about encountering something multiple times, is that stimuli has to be predictable. If you've got a variable stimuli, such as with offshore, wind production, then maybe what they encounter is different each time, and they interpret it in a different way, or that it might alter in terms of during, say, a migration of a fish, it might actually alter the perceived field that they receive because of local magnetic field changes or something. So the cumulative thing is really important, and it's cumulative in terms of passage over, but also in the life cycle. So if you have something like, for instance, we're just involved in a study in Belgium, which is looking at potential egg-laying species that leave their eggs next to a cable, then over the development phase, that cumulative sort of exposure might create something in terms of the development or the early life stages, and that may have a knock-on effect. So it's that time cumulative as well as a spatial cumulative. And then the other side of it is that obviously offshore wind is not the only thing in the environment. We've got lots going on. We've got lots of plans all over the world for new grid connections, for smart networks of cabling things. So it's not just, this shouldn't just be focused on offshore wind. So EMF is going to come from other industries as well, and then you've got that potential crossover in terms of cumulative effects. And then you've also got multiple stressors. So one of the things, well, I don't like using the word stressor because stressor indicates a negative thing. They might be, but they may not be. So for instance, a stressor or something that changes an animal might be something like underwater noise. So if underwater noise is there, maybe they won't encounter EMF. But if you have another change, which might be artificial reef effect, so animals, fish hanging around offshore wind, or lobsters hanging around a cable protection, then that might mean that they are cumulatively going to be encountering the EMF more. So there's a discussion to be had and studies to look at how the relative importance of these different elements which the animals are encountering in an environment which is fairly dramatically changed in all ways from humans' activity. But we need to understand whether they are an additional thing we have to mitigate, or whether actually we can discount them. And that's and cumulatively is the way that we have to try and understand that for the EMF topic, because it's both a spatial and a time-based cumulative aspect.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. It's a complex landscape out there, and there's a lot of changes that would be happening, and EMF is really just one of them. Yeah. We have about 3 or 4 minutes left on this topic area. So Zoe, I'm just going to transition to our final panel question, really about research needs, if that's okay. In the research brief, we compiled just a few research needs and recommendations. But I'd really like to hear from you based on what you know in your past research. What are additional research needs could be addressed in the near term for EMF effects?
Sure, thanks. I think I'll probably start by highlighting that research in this context is really benefited by cross-collaboration between disciplines. So interdisciplinary work, ecologists and biologists working with physicists and cable engineers is really like the best way forward in this context. In terms of the modelling that's available, I think even just like a more consistent approach to the reporting of the modelling and availability of that data, data availability from industry, such as the temporal variability and power levels, and power levels, and also the temporal change over different time scales would be really useful. The other thing, as well as the data sharing and modelling and such like, is to actually get out there and take measurements. And Andrew talked a little bit about the different methods that are available, but to remember to measure all of the components that are important to the receptive species, the magnetic field, but also the induced electric field. And then in terms of the species, I think that absolutely aquarium studies and field studies both have their place. They both can work together. We quite often focus on behavioural studies, but we also have to think about the physiological changes. The most relevant life stages as well. So as Andrew mentioned, the embryonic and larval stages, but also like the movement of species too. And when we're thinking about the movement and migration of species of receptive species through these cables, we have to be thinking about taking measurements at appropriate resolution as well. So quite often telemetry studies are not appropriately designed to actually capture responses to electromagnetic fields. We really need to be thinking about really fine scale telemetry in this context. So I suppose that's like a bit of a brief overview of the different things, but I'll close with the one on encounter rate. It's not really just about whether or not they are exposed, whether or not animals are exposed to electromagnetic fields. It's about how often they encounter it and for how long, and having that realistic understanding as to what actually goes on in an offshore wind farm or around an export cable. That's where I'd like to see the most growth.
Great. Thank you so much, Zoe and Andrew. I've learned a lot from you through this process, and I think there's a lot more to learn too. So I look forward to your continued work, and thanks for joining us today.
Great, thanks, Mark.
Very much. Thanks for listening.
Great, and I'm going to pass on to, well, I guess before I pass on, thank you for the questions we got in the chat. I tried to address several of those in the discussion. But if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to send me an email, and I'll make sure to connect you with the right people or the right research that helps address that question. With that, I'd like to pass it over to my colleague, Alicia Mahan, to start the discussion about vessel collisions.
Great, thanks, Mark. Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Mark, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that you sound great.
Great, thanks. Thanks again for being with us today. My name is Dr. Alicia Mahan with PNNL, and I'll be moderating the second half of our webinar today on the presence of vessels and the effects of vessel collision on marine life. At PNNL, I'm an ocean engineer and a project manager, program manager. I serve as our laboratory's wind energy program manager, managing our portfolio of land-based, distributed, and offshore wind projects for the Department of Energy Wind Energy Technologies Office. And within that portfolio, I also manage the Department of Energy LIDAR buoy program, and then I also work with Mark and others from PNNL and NREL on studying the environmental effects of offshore wind. So today we are joined by Jessica Morton from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and Cotton Rotwood from Point Blue Conservation Science for the panel discussion after our presentation. So next slide, please. Great, thank you. So presence of vessels. Vessel-based activities are an essential part of global infrastructure, and they support a wide array of industries such as trade, tourism, and resource development. However, the presence of vessels has introduced the risk of vessel collision with a variety of marine life. And while vessel collision is not a risk that's specific to offshore wind development, it is an important consideration in the offshore wind environmental assessment process. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So the development, the installation, operation, maintenance, and decommissioning of an offshore wind farm requires a variety of vessels that differ in size, in speed, and operating procedures. And these vessels include, but are not limited to, survey vessels, to turbine installation vessels, to jackup vessels, and crew transfer vessels. And the differences in vessel size and speed and operating procedures can result in a wide range of collision risk levels for different vessels and offshore wind development activities. So for example, while crew transport vessels, they may transit from port to site on a routine basis throughout the construction of a project. Other construction vessels may transit to the site much less frequently and remain stationary for the construction of a single turbine before transiting to the next installation location at reduced speeds. And that's the case for jackup vessels. Looking at vessel speeds, cable laying vessels operate at about 1 knot or less, while high resolution geophysical survey vessels have an operating speed of approximately 4 knots. Vessels that are less than 65 feet in length may fall outside of designated speed regulations, creating an increased risk of high force collisions with some marine animals. And if offshore wind components are manufactured overseas, then transoceanic transport will be necessary, further increasing the risk of vessel collisions. The number of offshore wind-related installation vessels is expected to increase, including in the United States, as multiple companies have committed to build and operate vessels that are compliant with the Jones Act. And so the Jones Act generally requires vessels carrying goods between any two ports in the United States to be domestically manufactured and registered, and to be owned and crewed by US citizens and permanent residents. Next slide, please. Great, thanks. So looking now at main risks and effects of vessel collision, species that spend significant time near the water surface and in areas where vessel routes overlap with migration, with feeding or breeding grounds, can be more susceptible to individual impacts from vessel collisions, for example, injury or mortality. And given the higher visibility of strandings and the low population levels of some species, whales have long been considered the primary marine animal impacted by vessel collisions, which has really instigated the need for special protections through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA's conservation and recovery programs that have resulted in more quantification of vessel strikes. And while impacts to whales and other large marine animals are often realized through documented strandings, the total number is likely to be underrepresented. And this is because of a lack of reporting awareness, whether the impact was felt or seen or otherwise witnessed when the incident occurred, also due to limited detection capabilities to find carcasses at sea, and sublethal injuries that may not be observable. And animals such as sea turtles may be underrepresented for that same lack of collision reporting awareness, but also just because of the difficulties recovering carcasses. It's estimated that nearly 1/3 of stranded loggerhead, leatherback, and green sea turtles in Florida had injuries that could be attributed to vessel collisions. And overall, research has shown that up to 75 different marine species may be involved in global vessel collisions. Next slide, please. Great, so there are two types of potential trauma associated with vessel collisions: blunt force and sharp force trauma. So looking at blunt force trauma, this is a result of collisions with surfaces of a vessel or dull components protruding from a vessel, such as dull bulbous bows. And injuries associated with blunt force trauma can include abrasions, contusions, lacerations, and fractures, for example, skull and bone fractures. And sharp force trauma is a result of collisions with sharper vessel components, such as rotating propeller blades or certain hull shapes. And injuries associated with sharp force trauma can include lacerations and potentially the amputation of flukes and flippers. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So vessel type, vessel speed, and species type are all primary factors in determining the likelihood of collision and severity of potential injury. And compared to smaller vessels, large vessels' increased length, width, and draft create just an extensive footprint that makes encounters with marine animals more likely. However, should a collision occur, vessels of all sizes can yield stresses that are high enough to cause lethal injuries to large whales. And whether an encounter involves a collision really depends on the combination of animal behavior, vessel speed, vessel maneuverability. And so slower speeds can provide time for marine animals and some vessel operators to react to avoid collisions. However, evidence suggests that large whales exhibit limited avoidance behaviors in close range. Next slide, please. Animals that experience impacts at lower speeds may have a higher probability of survival because reduced force associated with these collisions. So for instance, there's some evidence that the probability of lethal injuries for large whales falls to less than 50% when speeds of large vessels are reduced to 10 knots. However, Modeling suggests that large vessels can still produce large enough stresses to cause lethal injuries for large whales, even when traveling at reduced speeds. Moreover, small species such as sea turtles require more stringent speed reductions before lethal injury probabilities are reduced. And just in general, more research is needed here to really understand the correlation among vessel size, vessel speed, vessel hull type and technology, and species-specific impacts. And we'll talk about that a bit later. Next slide, please. So injured marine animals, they really have to expend increased amounts of energy on healing instead of on growing and reproducing. And so this extra energy can put the individual at risk of mortality while decreasing its potential to reproduce, which can result in significant population consequences for certain species. And when population numbers are low, the health and the vitality of one individual animal can really play an integral role in whether the species population level is capable of recovery. So for example, population numbers for the North Atlantic right whale have created a scenario in which losses from vessel collisions and other anthropogenic or human influenced activities have limited the potential for population recovery. Looking at the Pacific coast, there is growing evidence that mortalities from vessel collisions with blue, fin, and humpback whales are a significant contributor to anthropogenic deaths and could have negative impacts at the population level. And so while the population level impacts from vessel collisions for certain whale species are somewhat understood, similar consequences for other marine species, both large and small, are yet to be determined. Next slide, please. So shifting gears a little bit to talk about monitoring and mitigation methods. Monitoring for marine animals in the vicinity of vessels can help safeguard marine life against vessel collision. In the United States, protected species observers, or PSOs, are used to visually monitor areas for the presence of species that are federally protected under both the Endangered Species and/or the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And PSOs collect information about the behavior, the distribution, and abundance of marine animals in the vicinity of offshore activities and relay observations to vessel operators to institute mitigation measures and to avoid vessel interactions with marine life, including potential collisions such as reducing the vessel speed and/or changing course. Passive acoustic monitoring systems can also be used to detect marine mammals by listening for vocalizations underwater. Aerial surveys are also used as early warning systems to monitor protected species, and reported sightings are made available to mariners in an effort to increase awareness. Real-time vessel-based reporting, whether voluntary or mandatory, can also be used to reduce vessel collisions. Vessel-based software can be used to track marine animal sighting locations and share sighting information with mariners. And in addition, mobile phone technology can also be used to share marine animal sighting information and potential mitigation measures with others via mobile phone alerting systems. Several mitigation approaches can be used to reduce the risk of vessels colliding with marine animals. Speed reductions are widely implemented to reduce vessel collision risks. So for example, in 2008, mandatory vessel speed restrictions were instituted in certain areas and at certain times of the year off the Atlantic coast through the ship strike reduction rule to reduce the risk of collision, of vessel collisions with North Atlantic right whales. And in 2015, voluntary vessel speed reductions were implemented in shipping routes off California to reduce the number of whale mortalities caused by vessel collision. Vessels can also change course or be rerouted to avoid interactions and collisions with marine animals. And on the Atlantic and Pacific coast, vessel routes have been amended to reduce vessel collisions with blue, humpback, and North Atlantic right whales. And in addition, vessel exclusion zones or areas to be avoided can be established. Seasonal management areas have been delineated where right whales are likely to be present during specific times of the year and require vessels 65 feet or longer to travel at 10 knots or less. And voluntary dynamic management areas can also be established based on visual sightings that identify the presence of 3 or more right whales within an area, and mariners are encouraged to avoid these areas and travel at 10 knots or less. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, as offshore wind development continues to advance in the United States, several knowledge gaps and research needs must be addressed to develop a more comprehensive understanding of vessel collision risk. So the risk of marine animal injury and mortality from collision with vessels associated with offshore wind activities must be evaluated to inform the development of effective mitigation measures, and the effectiveness of those strategies must be monitored. Uncertainty remains regarding the distribution of collision risk and mortality estimates over large whale species, especially for the North Atlantic right and fin whales on the Atlantic coast, and blue, humpback fin, and gray whales on the Pacific coast. Regarding sea turtles, there's a need to understand the seasonal and geographic patterns of the risk of injury and mortality from vessel collisions associated with offshore wind activities to inform mitigation measures. Areas with a high risk of vessel collisions need to be identified, and offshore wind and non-offshore wind related vessel patterns need to be understood. For smaller animals, little is known about the extent of collision incidences, and protocols must be developed and instituted to identify collision-related blunt force trauma during necropsy procedures. Vessel speed reductions and route restrictions have successfully mitigated vessel collision risk for whales, and similar approaches may be effective to avoid interactions with other marine species, although a high level of compliance will be required of vessel operators. And then finally, education and awareness about the risks of vessel collision with marine life are really critical for mariners to implement appropriate mitigation approaches for offshore wind and non-offshore wind related activities. So next slide, please. So with that, we're going to transition now to the panel discussion on the vessel collision topic, and I'd like to formally introduce Jessica Morton and Cotton Rockwood. Jessica Morton is a resource protection specialist with the Greater Farallones Association and NOAA's Channel Islands, Cordell Bank, and Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuaries. She serves as a project coordinator and data analyst for West Coast whale conservation work for NOAA's Office of Marine Sanctuaries, with a focus on reducing the risk of ship strikes on endangered whales in California. Jess has a BA in environmental science from Skidmore College and an MA in international environmental policy from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. So welcome, Jessica. And Cotton Rockwood is the senior marine ecologist with Point Blue Conservation Science. He works on marine megafauna ecology and species modeling research and marine spatial planning. He's worked on both ship strikes to whales and low impact siting of renewable marine energy. Cotton attended University of California, Davis for his Bachelor's of Science in Biology, and Scripps Institution of Oceanography for his graduate work in biological oceanography. So thanks for joining us, Cotton. And so we're really thrilled today that you're both joining us. As we were conducting the background research and the literature review on this topic, both of your names really kind of rose to the top as experts in this field on both the Atlantic and Pacific coast. So we really couldn't ask for two more informed researchers to be here today to share your insights and perspectives on the effects of vessel collision on marine life. So I have some questions to pose to the both of you to share your thoughts on the state of the knowledge, monitoring and minimization, cumulative impacts, and also some research needs. So to kick us off with the first question, I'd like to ask the both of you, maybe starting with Cotton first, about the state of the science on this topic. In your opinion, what's the current understanding that you would like to highlight for environmental effects associated with offshore wind development and vessel collision? And are there any lessons learned that you'd like to share with us?
Absolutely. Thanks, Alicia. And thanks for the opportunity to participate in this panel. It's really great. Again, as Andrew pointed out, important to be discussing these challenges. And ship strikes are a really big challenge, not just because of the vast array of species that they effect, but also because they're a data poor problem. You know, in general, ship strikes are relatively infrequent, and as you mentioned in your presentation, many of those go undocumented. So that's a really difficult thing. We don't have the kind of data that would really help to define the problem in a very explicit and quantitative way. So there have been different ways that have tried to approach that, between looking at global data sets to try and assess the level of ship strikes, the frequency and the relationship with speed, for example. That was a big effort that really was done largely related to strikes on the East Coast for right whales. And so the other sort of approach that's been taken is a more process-related modeling approach, ranging from looking at scale models of whales and ships to quantitative computer-based models in terms of the strike forces that have occurred and what those would mean in terms of the potential for lethality. And as well, looking at sort of spatial modeling in terms of the likelihood of encounters for different organisms in the ocean with vessels. So there's a lot going on, a lot of different ways that people have tried to get at the real impact of this issue. And there's still a lot to be found more in terms of better understanding. So one of the major things that I think remains is adding additional data. And in fact, I think that this problem with offshore wind could be a place where that could be a big benefit if there's enforced monitoring of these increased vessel traffic.
Great, thanks. If I could ask you a follow-up question, you talked a little bit about modeling, and frankly, we looked at a lot of your research in the development of this brief. Can you maybe talk a little bit about some of those models and maybe some of the limitations to using these models to understand the likelihood of an encounter?
Yeah, so there's basically, in terms of the spatial likelihood of encounter, there are statistical methods that are used in population biology and physics, lots of different fields that can determine, sort of given the characteristics of movement in a given area, how likely an encounter is to occur between two moving objects. And so that's sort of the basis for where the modeling has come in. But then beyond that, there's also the issue of, if an encounter occurs, how likely is it to cause damage or injury or even mortality? And so there's multiple probabilistic components to that, and those are challenging because that's one of the places where I was mentioning there's a lot of information that is not known with certainty. One of those biggest ones is, what is the avoidance component of the probability of mortality and injury? How much do different animals actually avoid collision at different scales? And there's some evidence that there is some avoidance, particularly at larger scales for large marine mammals when they're diving. But when it comes to the close encounter, there's fairly limited avoidance, especially as speed increases.
Great, thanks. So Jessica, I'd like to pose that same original question to you as well, to get your thoughts in terms of your perspective and insight on the current understanding that you'd like to highlight on environmental effects associated with offshore wind and vessel collision, and also just any lessons learned that you'd like to share.
Sure. Thank you, Alicia, for the awesome overview too. And good morning to everybody. Thanks so much for including me in these discussions today. I don't have a ton to pile on top of what Cotton shared, but I'll highlight a bunch of what Cotton shared. And as Alicia also highlighted and shared and emphasized, for the issue of vessel collisions on protected species, especially for smaller species like turtles, getting good data and good estimates on how often these things are happening is probably the biggest challenge for this issue. But we do definitely know from whales stranding on the coast with injuries that are consistent with blunt force trauma and internal hemorrhaging, and also just from documenting vessel-caused injuries that are observed on whales and sea turtles as well. We definitely know vessel strikes are happening. And like Cotton said, we know from models that ship strikes are likely occurring just based on the overlap that exists.
Mm-hmm.
And we also know that in any area where these protected species are spending time at the surface, or where they're migrating, anywhere where we increase the vessel traffic in that area, we're inevitably going to increase this vessel collision risk. And it's definitely not something that's unique to US waters. Vessel strikes are documented globally. They're mitigated globally. They're mitigated on a lethal and non-lethal basis, and focused on large vessels primarily in the US, but small vessels also and in other areas. And so while the data, I will say, is pretty unclear on exactly how often these things are happening, there are definitely a lot of lessons learned that have come from past measures that are trialed nationally and also abroad that can definitely be applied to offshore wind management and have been applied already. And so like Cotton said, offshore wind should really just take into account what historical and predicted seasonal density we know for protected species when thinking through where we're going to put wind farm operations. And then where that overlap does exist, we can implement some measures to reduce the risk that I think we're going to talk about in a second.
Great, thank you. That's super helpful. That dovetails nicely into my next question for you both on monitoring and mitigation. Kind of in your thoughts, and maybe Jessica, we can start with you this time. What are your thoughts on the emerging or state-of-the-art monitoring and minimization techniques for vessel collision, and how those can be considered for offshore wind on both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts? And I'd actually like to add on top of that too, because we talked a little bit about the challenges associated with smaller species like sea turtles. So if you have any thoughts too, kind of about what state-of-the-art techniques can be used for smaller species, I'd be interested in hearing that also.
Yeah, so I will start, and Cotton, please fill in the things that I don't mention. But I think when I think of the term state-of-the-art, I think that can apply to some of the monitoring techniques that can be applied to whales and also to sea turtles. When it comes to instituting measures and trying to minimizing risk, I don't know that state-of-the-art really is the term I would use, but there are measures that you went over, Alicia, that have proven to be effective in terms of reducing the vessel collision risk overall. And so the best solution out there that's currently employed, the best two solutions, I should say, the first one is really just to try to separate vessel activity and protected species altogether.
Mm-hmm.
And so like you were mentioning, that can be done with ship routing or establishing vessel avoidance areas to be avoided. But when that separation is not possible to achieve, and that's a really common issue since species are going to be in different areas, they're not all going to be in one nice, neat space overlapping. And obviously the ocean's a really dynamic place. So introducing vessel speed limits, like you were mentioning, is really probably the most widely used approach to try to reduce risk. And that's for both small and large vessels globally. And so reducing the risk not only increases the likelihood that the vessel can be avoided, and that's either by the vessel or by this protected species can potentially avoid the vessel collision. But it also decreases, like Cotton was saying, the lethality of that strike if the collision does occur. And then in addition to that, with these measures that have proven to reduce vessel collision risk, we also know that slowing down vessels, small and large, also contributes to a decrease in underwater noise, which is definitely a benefit to whales and other species. And one other measure that I know has been employed for other wind farm development conversations and management efforts is restricting the time and the timing of certain operations of wind farm operations. So whether that's construction activities, whether that's delivering parts that are needed for the wind farm operation, really trying to be targeted about when vessel activity needs to be high based on what we know in terms of the months or times of year when protected species are out of the area. That can be a really effective way to limit the vessel collision risk. So I will pause there and pass it to Cotton.
Thanks, Jessica.
Yeah, and so maybe just covering a little bit more on the monitoring side, there, essentially there's kind of two components that are the main monitoring components to this. One is the animals and the other is the ships. And so knowing where each of those is and what they're doing are the key components on that. When it comes to monitoring animals, there's a couple of different sort of, I'd say, realms of approach. One is you can look at the sort of the long-term patterns. So looking at surveys, doing statistical models that look at, both, annual types of patterns, but also looking at where animals are most frequently, where they're spending their time, and where they have ecologically important activities. Those are really valuable because it means those areas should be avoided as best possible. But it really does give that overview picture. The other component is looking at sort of finer scale, both temporally and spatially, and looking at high risk areas. So this is something that certainly could be applied to offshore wind because the transits of these vessels are most likely going to be fairly regular, especially during the operational phase. And that is monitoring the presence and to the extent possible, the locations of animals in real or near real time. And you mentioned this in your presentation. So you can have observers that are documenting the presence of animals, whether that's shore-based or on vessels. The vessels themselves that are doing the transiting for offshore wind, they could have observers on board, and those could be reporting sightings. And there are systems that are in place in various locations that help to aggregate that information. In addition, you can have acoustic monitoring. Acoustic monitoring has its limits because organisms aren't always making noise, but for those that do have vocalizations, they can be helpful to establish presence, though unfortunately, the range of acoustic monitoring doesn't necessarily tell you exactly where those animals are. So there's a limitation there. But nonetheless can be helpful to say there are quite a few of these potentially at-risk organisms here. I think the other thing is vessel monitoring. In that case, there is a system in place. There's actually several systems in place that are largely based around vessel safety, but the automatic identification system, AIS, is a system that most vessels carry, especially in the US, that identifies their position, their speed, their direction of travel. So the data that that system puts out is actually accessible both to the public and to researchers to the extent that you can access it either, well, anyway, it's open source in essence. And so it can be used to identify the locations and patterns of vessel traffic and therefore understand better the risks. And then finally, sorry, just one more thing. It's really the monitoring of the actual results in terms of collision. So that's the monitoring networks that exist. And thankfully, in this country, we have a pretty good system where reports of stranded animals, whether that's at sea or on the coast, are often responded to by a whole network of stranding response trained professionals, and they can understand then when those have occurred because of strikes and help to increase the data that we have around this.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll switch to one more facilitated question before we take some of the Q&A, the questions that are in the chat from the participants, but this one's around cumulative impacts. And as Mark in the previous panel mentioned, this is a pretty hot topic that could have a dedicated webinar all to itself, but looking at cumulative impacts of offshore wind and other ocean activities. So in your thoughts, Jessica, maybe we can start here with you. How might the effects from vessel collisions contribute to cumulative impacts on marine life that result from the combined effects from multiple activities or industries? And in your mind, kind of, what are the associated challenges with cumulative impacts analysis for offshore wind development?
Sure. So I think definitely the first other impact that I can think of that seems relevant for this discussion is commercial shipping routing in general. And so one impact to consider related to where the wind farms go is what the placement of these wind farm operations will do to the current routes and distribution and density of the vessel traffic. And we have thousands of commercial vessels that are traveling around our coastlines each year, and they're a great thing. We need them. They obviously support our economy and bring us the goods that we rely on, but there are obviously a lot of impacts associated with that vessel traffic, and where it travels is really important when we think through protecting a lot of these protected species that we're focused on. And so that's something that I think really does need to get considered. I know for the West Coast, several potential locations for wind farm operations may end up shifting where that commercial vessel traffic is taking place. And so that's something that should be carefully looked at and considered when thinking through where to place these new operations.
Great, thanks. Cotton, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah, and then I'll follow on to that specific point, which is that shifting traffic might actually have a benefit. There is the possibility that, at least especially on the coast here, shifting traffic offshore overlaps less with a lot of the species because there's high activity on the coastal shelf. And so both on the west and the east coast, there are considerations there where if the commercial traffic, the existing traffic, moves due to the placement of these installations, there could be a reduction in risk, but that's not certain. Another point there is that there are trade-offs when it comes to the cumulative impacts component. So it's a multidimensional problem. You're not talking about just one species, and the species distributions of all of these species are not coincident. And so you may increase the risk of strike to one species by decreasing it for another. So making sure that you're doing the best possible job accounting for those multiple effects to different species is important. I think another issue here with cumulative impacts is that a lot of these species, as you mentioned, are long-lived and low fecundity species. So impacts can be great when just one or a few individuals are harmed. And so you really do need to especially take into account the impacts of other sources of harm and mortality. And so for large whales, ship strikes are among the top causes of death in many locations. Another one is entanglement, and certainly that's been an issue on both the west and east coast. And so entanglement of large whales in fishing gear specifically can kill them. It can also decrease their physical state, which can expose them to greater risk when it comes to ship strikes. So I think those are definitely some important things to consider on cumulative impacts.
Great, and thanks for mentioning the topic of entanglement. And just to highlight, we actually have a research brief topic on the risks of secondary entanglement. So marine life becoming entangled with marine debris wrapped around a mooring line. So we have a research brief on that through the SEER project, and that's available on TSIS for anyone that's interested in learning more. I would like to shift to the chat. There are a couple of questions that I'd like to pose to you. The latest question is, do you know how is the offshore wind sector working with the marine mammal and sea turtle stranding networks? Do you know if there's kind of an established relationship there, or if there's kind of any sort of data sharing or information sharing among the stranding networks and the offshore wind industry?
I do not know of any specific thing going on. I am not as familiar with the situation on the East Coast, which is where that would probably be happening more so, given the sort of the status of development. But I certainly would be a good thing to bring those communities together, because monitoring historically can give us a bit of a baseline, and then potential for increases or decreases in occurrence of stranded animals might give us a clue as to whether there's an impact of offshore wind development.
Okay, great, thank you. Jessica, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't have much to add there, but I will just, I guess, highlight and emphasize that NOAA, through this amazing network of partners, does track all of the strandings that are happening nationally. But I think, as we've talked about, I'll emphasize again that while they're definitely worth tracking, I mean, if we have a year where we see strandings attributed to vessel collisions in particular are way up, that would be incredibly concerning and worth noting. But in general, the strandings record really does offer us, unfortunately, an imperfect picture of how often these things are happening. So something that's tracked, I know, and I think I absolutely agree and recommend it should get shared with offshore wind development partners, but worth always noting and considering that those records aren't necessarily indicative of the actual problem.
Great, thank you. I had another question come through about kind of mitigation technologies, actually, and there was a question about if you know if there's any sort of technology or tool or sensor that can be mounted on vessels that can warn marine life if ships are in the area or kind of deter them from entering an area.
Yeah, so I would say there's been some concerted effort in trying to look at this problem from that perspective. And at this point, there really hasn't been any success in a technological approach other than in terms of monitoring improvements. There has been work looking at infrared camera systems to identify the presence of whales. Of course, that's a very challenging problem in a very, messy marine environment, and these animals are often below the surface, so it's quite imperfect. And there's also been work looking at whether there are sounds that could be used to deter collision potential, but there's some serious challenges or problems with that approach, which is you're introducing sound into the environment on purpose, which is also a pollutant in the marine environment, essentially. So you're potentially doing harm. On top of that, where there were trials, there was not really any successful alerting for the marine mammals that were targeted.
Great, thank you. Jessica, do you have anything to add before we wrap up?
Not much. I mean, I appreciate the question. I always think about it as sort of like the deer whistle approach. And like Cotton said, it hasn't necessarily had concrete success. We haven't had the response from the protected species that we were hoping for when we've introduced that type of deterrent technology into the ocean environment. And definitely agree with what Cotton said, that I think many of us are really sensitive already to putting more noise into an already noisy ocean environment. So I personally, I would love to see some sort of sensor development that could potentially detect collisions and quantify collisions in some way. I'm not an engineer, sadly, so I don't know what the feasibility would be of something like that. But at this point, there's really no good way to try to deter the protected species of interest from oncoming vessel traffic. So those measures we mentioned are really the approach that are used.
Great, thank you. So with that, we have 3 minutes left. I want to thank both Cotton and Jessica for being here today. We are actively finalizing the research brief on this topic, and it will be officially published on TEFIS in the coming weeks. And the link to that, to where the brief will be published, is at the bottom of this slide. Mark, can you move to the next slide, please? So again, we want to thank you for being here today, and we also want to thank and acknowledge the sponsor for this work, the U.S. Department of Energy Wind Energy Technologies Office. From there, we want to thank Joy Page, who gave the introduction of SEER and our project at the beginning of our presentation, also to Jocelyn Brown Saraceno and Naomi Lewandowski. And we also want to take the time to thank our subject matter experts and panelists today, Andrew Gill and Zoe Hutchinson on the EMF topic, and Jessica Morton and Cotton Rockwood on the vessel collision topic. And we also, as Joy mentioned in the beginning, want to give a big thanks to the members of our SEER Science and Technology Advisory Committee for really helping shape our research and provide really thoughtful insight into our research briefs and presentations. Next slide, please. So Haley from PNNL put a link in the chat. We will be posting a recording of today's webinar with the slides on the link in the chat. And 2 of the 7 research briefs are officially published on TETHIS. The 2 that are available for you to download and read at your leisure are underwater noise effects on marine life and risk to marine life from marine debris and floating cable systems. That is the brief I just mentioned during the panel discussion. And we are actively working on publishing 2 more on benthic disturbance and the introduction of new structures. All of those recordings from those presentations are available on TETHIS. So with that, thank you so much for coming today. I did say that there are several other questions in the chat that we just unfortunately did not have time to address, but we've made note of them and who asked them, and we will get back to you with answers to those questions. So again, thank you very, very much and have a great rest of your week. Thanks, everybody.